Hello, and welcome. I'm your night librarian. So glad you're here tonight. I hope you don't mind. I've put on some relaxing music for you. It should begin shortly, softly in the background. Let's take a moment to slow down together. There's nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Let's light up the candle. Just a small, warm glow, steady and comforting. Take a gentle breath in and let it go. Tonight, we'll be talking about something simple, something calm, something that you can drift in and out of as you rest. You don't need to stay awake. Just listen, relax, and allow yourself to fall asleep whenever you're ready. This library grows with its travelers. If these stories help you rest, subscribing helps us grow and guides other sleepless souls here. A like or a quiet comment is always appreciated. But for now, all you need to do is relax. The library is quiet. The candle is lit. Settle in. Get comfortable. And allow your eyes to grow heavy. Tonight, the doors to the sanctuary are open just for you. As the world outside grows quiet and the shadows lengthen, the librarian invites you to step inside, away from the noise and the frantic pace of the day. You may be familiar with the famous words of Dale Carnegie, or perhaps you've seen his book on many shelves. But tonight, the librarian has something better to offer. Instead of a manual of rules or a list of instructions, we are going to explore the heart of those lessons through the power of story. It is one thing to read a principle. It is another to feel it breathe. These narratives are designed to help you learn the most important truths of human connection, or perhaps to simply refresh a memory you already hold. By weaving these timeless principles into the quiet fabric of a story, they settle deeper into the mind. As you drift towards sleep, these lessons will take root, so that when you wake, you may find yourself using them effortlessly in your daily life, speaking a little more kindly, listening a little more deeply, and moving through the world with a new sense of grace. The fire is low. Let the weight of the day fall away as we turn to the first page. The first story's title is The Old Collector. The autumn light fell through Mr. Hartley's shop window in golden bars, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny planets through their own quiet universe. Thomas pressed his nose against the glass, leaving a small circle of fog that bloomed and faded with his breathing. Inside, he could see shelves that climbed toward shadowed ceilings, each one crowded with objects that seemed to whisper of distant places and forgotten times. The door gave a soft chime as he pushed it open. The smell met him first: old paper and wood polish, leather and something else. Something like the attic at his grandmother's house, where time moved differently. The floorboards creaked beneath his sneakers, a sound that seemed too loud in the hushed space, and Thomas found himself walking more carefully, as if he'd entered a library or a church. Mr. Hartley sat behind a counter of dark mahogany, his white hair catching the afternoon light. He wore a cardigan the color of moss, and his hands, spotted with age, the knuckles prominent, rested on an open book. He looked up as Thomas approached, his eyes magnified slightly behind wire-rimmed glasses, but he didn't smile. He simply watched, waiting, as shopkeepers of his generation often did. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Thomas had come here on a day from his friends, who whispered that old man Hartley never smiled, never spoke unless spoken to, and certainly never welcomed children into his peculiar shop. But now, standing in that amber light with those patient eyes upon him, Thomas felt the day dissolve into something else, a genuine curiosity about this place that existed like a pocket of the past in their modern street. His gaze drifted across the counter and landed on a shallow wooden tray lined with velvet. Coins lay arranged there in careful rows, their surfaces catching the light in unexpected ways. Some were dark with tarnish, others gleamed with a dull gold or silver sheen. They were nothing like the coins in his pocket. These looked ancient, important, as if they carried within them the weight of all the hands that had held them before. Thomas stared at the coins, his mind racing through possibilities. He could ask how much they cost. That's what people did in shops. But something told him these weren't really for sale, not in the ordinary way. He could comment on how old they looked, but that seemed obvious, even foolish. What did he know about old coins anyway? His friends' voices echoed in his memory. Just go in and buy something, anything. Prove you're not scared of him. But standing here now, Thomas realized he wasn't scared. He was something else entirely. The old man wasn't frightening. He was sad, perhaps, or lonely, sitting in this shop full of beautiful things with no one to share them with. Thomas thought about his own collections at home. The rocks from different beaches, each one labeled with a date and location in his careful handwriting. The baseball cards sorted by team and year. His mother always asked why he kept them, what the point was, and he could never quite explain that it wasn't about the objects themselves. It was about the memories attached to them, the stories they held, the way each one marked a moment in time. Maybe Mr. Hartley felt the same way about his coins. The thought arrived like a key turning in a lock. These coins weren't merchandise, they were a collection, and collectors, Thomas knew from his own experience, didn't want to be told how impressive their collections were. They wanted to share what made each piece special. They wanted someone to ask, to care, to understand. Thomas's father collected stamps and could talk for hours about watermarks and printing errors, his face animated in a way it never was when discussing his accounting work. His aunt collected vintage teacups and knew the story behind each delicate piece. Even his little sister collected smooth stones from the garden, and she could tell you which one she'd found on the day it rained, which one was from the morning she saw a robin's nest. The question formed in his mind carefully, like a seed taking root. Not how much are these, or are these valuable, but something different. Something that acknowledged what he sensed to be true, that each of these coins had traveled through time and space, had rested in purses and pockets, had purchased bread or paid soldiers, had witnessed empires rise and fall. He cleared his throat softly, the sound almost lost in the quiet shop. Mr. Hartley's eyes shifted from the book to the boy's face, patient and neutral, waiting to see what this young visitor would prove to be. Another curious child who would touch things with sticky fingers and leave, or perhaps something else. Thomas pointed to a coin near the center of the display, one that gleamed with a greenish patina. It bore the profile of a face he didn't recognize, the features worn smooth by centuries. "Where did that one come from?" he asked. Then, because it felt important to be specific, to show he genuinely wanted to know, "I mean, what's the story behind it? Who do you think held it first?" The change in Mr. Hartley's face was subtle but unmistakable. The corners of his eyes softened first, tiny creases appearing where the tension had been. His mouth, which had been a straight line of polite indifference, curved upward ever so slightly. He reached for the coin Thomas had indicated, his movements slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial. "This," he said, and his voice was warmer than Thomas had expected, like honey in tea, "is a Roman denarius from the reign of Hadrian, 2nd century AD. He held it up to the light, rotating it between his thumb and forefinger. "See the profile? That's the emperor himself. And on the reverse," he turned it over, "you can just make out Britannia, commemorating his visit to Britain." Thomas leaned closer, genuinely fascinated now. So someone in ancient Rome actually used this to buy things. Perhaps a soldier stationed along Hadrian's wall, Mr. Hartley said, his eyes brightening. "Or merchant in Londinium. It could have purchased a week's worth of bread, or a simple oil lamp. The remarkable thing is that we can still hold it, still see the emperor's face after nearly 2,000 years." He set it down gently and gestured to another coin. "Now this one has an even more interesting journey." 2 hours passed like minutes. Mr. Hartley brought out coins from drawers and cases, each one accompanied by its story: a Spanish doubloon from a shipwreck, a Byzantine solidus that had traveled the Silk Road, a colonial-era penny minted in Philadelphia. Thomas listened, asked questions, learned the difference between bronze and brass patinas, discovered how to read ancient Greek letters, understood why some coins were clipped at the edges. When Thomas finally noticed the light fading outside, he stood reluctantly. "I should get home before dinner," he said. "But could I? Would it be okay if I came back? Maybe tomorrow?" Mr. Hartley smiled, a full smile this time, and nodded. "I'll show you the medieval collection. There's a coin from the time of Eleanor of Aquitaine that I think you'd appreciate." As Thomas walked toward the door, Mr. Hartley called after him, "Thank you, young man. It's been quite some time since anyone asked about the stories." Outside, the evening air felt cool and fresh. Thomas's friends were waiting at the corner, eager to hear about his dare. But as he walked toward them, he realized he had something better than a completed dare. He had a friend who knew about ancient Rome, and a standing invitation to return tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. The shop light glowed warm behind him as he turned the corner, and already he was thinking of questions to ask next time. The next story's title is The Stonemason. The cathedral steps were cool beneath Marcus's knees, even through the worn fabric of his work trousers. His chisel moved in small, precise taps against the limestone, each strike sending tiny chips spiraling down to join the pale dust that coated his boots and settled into the creases of his weathered hands. The morning sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders, casting his shadow long across the stone he shaped. Around him, the city moved with its usual rhythm. Footsteps hurried past, leather soles on ancient stone, the click of heels, the scuff of sneakers. People climbed these steps every day, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, moving between the street and the cathedral entrance. They talked on phones, checked watches, juggled coffee cups and briefcases. Marcus had learned long ago not to expect them to notice him. He was part of the architecture, as invisible as the gargoyles that watched from the roofline above. The smell of stone dust mingled with morning coffee from the cafe across the square. Somewhere a bus hissed to a stop, released passengers, pulled away again. A pigeon landed near Marcus's toolbox, cocked its head at him with one bright eye, then strutted away when he offered no food. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. Marcus brushed dust from the rosette he was carving, revealing the petals he'd spent the past 2 weeks perfecting. This one would replace a section damaged by weather and time, matching the 19th century work that surrounded it. It needed to be perfect, not for any glory or recognition, but because that's what the work demanded. Stone remembered poor craftsmanship forever, outlasting the hands that shaped it by centuries. His back ached from the bent position. His knuckles complained about the morning dampness. He was 63 years old, and he'd been doing this work since he was 17, learning from his father who had learned from his father before him. 4 to 6 years of invisible labor, of repairs that went unnoticed because they blended seamlessly with the original work. That was the point, he reminded himself. That was the pride of it, to be so skilled that no one could tell where the old work ended and the new began. A shadow fell across his work. Marcus didn't look up immediately, expecting it to pass like all the others, but it remained, a still presence in his peripheral vision. He paused, chisel hovering, and glanced up to find a woman standing 3 steps above him, her hand resting on the iron railing. She was perhaps 40, dressed in a charcoal suit that suggested business meetings and important appointments. But she wasn't checking her phone or hurrying past. She was looking at his work, really looking, her head tilted slightly as she studied the half-finished rosette. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Sometimes people stopped to watch, treating him like a street performer, waiting for something impressive to happen. Or they asked how much longer the work would take, implying that his presence was an inconvenience, an obstacle to be endured. Once, a man had complained that the tapping noise was disturbing his phone call. He waited for her to speak, to ask when he'd be finished, to wonder aloud why old buildings needed so much maintenance. His response was already forming. Polite, brief, designed to send her on her way so he could return to his work in peace. But she said nothing. She simply looked, and in her looking, Marcus began to see his own work through fresh eyes. The pattern he'd been creating, 5 petals radiating from a central point, each one slightly different as nature made them, each curve flowing into the next with the organic logic of a real flower. The depth he'd carved into the stone, creating shadows that would shift throughout the day as the sun moved. The way the new limestone would gradually weather and darken until it became indistinguishable from its neighbors, his work absorbed into the greater whole. How long had it been since he'd really looked at what he did? Weeks of small tasks, one after another. Replace a crumbling final here, recut a worn inscription there, patch mortar, clean oxidation from copper details. Necessary work, skilled work, but work that had become routine. He arrived each morning, opened his toolbox, and moved through the day with the muscle memory of decades. His father used to say that stonemasons were custodians of history, that their hands connected the present to the past. As a young man, Marcus had felt that deeply. He'd felt honored to join a tradition stretching back centuries. But somewhere along the way, through years of being unseen, through shoulders that ached and hands that grew stiff, through mornings of arriving before the city woke and evenings of packing his tools in twilight, that sense of honor had worn down like stone beneath countless footsteps. Now this woman stood watching, and Marcus found himself wondering what she saw. Did she see an old man hunched over broken stone? Or did she see something else? The detail is extraordinary, she said finally, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the morning air. The way you've carved the depth into each petal, they look like they could move in the wind. Marcus sat back on his heels, surprised. You know something about stone carving? She shook her head, smiling slightly. Not really, but I know skill when I see it. I'm an architect. She gestured toward the rosette. I design buildings, but I could never do what you're doing. This kind of work, it requires patience, artistry, years of knowledge. You're not just replacing a damaged piece. You're keeping the building's story continuous. Something loosened in Marcus's chest. He looked down at his work, then back up at her. Most people don't notice, he said. That's the goal, really, to make repairs invisible. That's what makes it remarkable, she replied. You're so skilled that your work disappears into the greater whole. But that doesn't make it less important. Buildings like this exist because of people like you. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You're not maintaining the cathedral. You're preserving it. There's a difference. Marcus felt heat rise to his face, a flush of emotion he couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, but also something deeper, recognition. To be seen, truly seen. Not as an obstacle or a curiosity, but as a craftsman, an artist, a guardian of something beautiful and old and worth preserving. Thank you, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. That means more than you might think. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. I'll be late for my meeting now, but I'm glad I stopped. My father was a carpenter, real woodwork, the kind nobody does anymore. He would have appreciated your skill. After she left, Marcus sat for a long moment before returning to his chisel. But something had shifted. The stone beneath his hands felt different now. Not just limestone that needed shaping, but something precious, worthy of his best effort. Each tap of his chisel was deliberate, careful, an act of devotion rather than routine. The morning moved forward around him. People climbed the steps, descended them, hurried past on their various urgent errands. But Marcus no longer felt invisible. He felt seen, acknowledged, important. One person had stopped, had truly looked, had understood the value of what he did. And somehow that single moment of recognition rekindled something he'd thought long extinguished. As the sun reached its zenith, Marcus finished the final petal. He brushed the dust away and studied his work with new eyes. Yes, it would weather and blend. Yes, it would become invisible to most who passed. But he would know it was there. He would know the care that had gone into each curve and shadow. And now, somewhere in the city, someone else knew too. That evening, as he packed his tools, Marcus ran his hand over the completed rosette one last time. Tomorrow he would move to the next repair, and the next, and the work would continue as it always had. But something had changed. He remembered now why he'd chosen this craft, why his father had loved it, why it mattered. The stone would remember his hands long after he was gone, and that was enough. The next story's title is The Mountain Guide. The forest floor was soft beneath Elena's boots, years of fallen needles creating a carpet that muffled footsteps and held the morning dampness. Mist clung to the lower branches of the pines, turning the familiar trail into something dreamlike, as if she and her client had stepped into a world where the ordinary rules of light and shadow no longer applied. The air smelled of earth and resin, of moss and the faint sweetness of wild berries ripening in hidden clearings. She paused at a fork in the trail, waiting for the group of 6 hikers behind her to catch up. They moved in a ragged line, some energetic and sure-footed, others picking their way more carefully over exposed roots and scattered stones. This was their 3rd day on the mountain, and Elena could read them now, who would push ahead given the chance, who preferred to linger and observe, who needed frequent water breaks and who would forget to hydrate until reminded. The younger man, Daniel, arrived first, slightly breathless but eager. He studied the 2 paths diverging before them, one climbing steeply to the left through a corridor of darker trees, the other curving right along what appeared to be a gentler grade. His hand moved to the trail map folded in his jacket pocket, and Elena could see the question forming on his face even before he spoke. Behind him came the others, Margaret with her expensive camera in careful stride, the couple from Seattle who moved as one unit, the older gentleman who'd introduced himself simply as Robert, and finally Sarah, who stopped frequently to sketch wildflowers in a small notebook. They gathered at the junction, grateful for the rest, shrugging off day packs and reaching for water bottles. The mountain rose above them, invisible in the mist but present nonetheless, a weight and promise that pulled at them all. The summit waited somewhere beyond the trees and clouds, and each person in the group had their own reasons for wanting to reach it. Elena had learned over 15 years of guiding that the destination mattered less than how you arrived there, and that the path chosen revealed more about the journey than any map could show. Daniel pulled out his map, unfolding it with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to planning and precision. According to this, he said, his finger tracing the contour lines, the left path is more direct, steeper, but would save at least 40 minutes. Given the weather forecast, that might matter. Elena nodded, listening. She'd known Daniel would advocate for the direct route. He'd been checking his watch throughout the hike, calculating distances and elevation gains, treating the mountain like a problem to be solved efficiently. There was nothing wrong with his approach. She'd guided hundreds like him, people who found satisfaction and optimization in taking the shortest line between 2 points. But she'd also learned that mountains had their own wisdom, and that the shortest path wasn't always the best one. The right path follows the ridgeline, Elena said, her voice neutral, inviting rather than instructing. It's longer, yes, but the grade is gentler. We'd see more of the valley as we climb. But the mist, Daniel countered, not dismissively, but with the logic that had probably served him well in his career, whatever it was. We won't see the valley anyway, and if the weather turns, we want to be at the summit and back below the tree line. The direct route makes sense. Margaret stepped closer to examine both paths. I've read that the Ridge Trail has better wildflowers this time of year, she said quietly. And the light, if the mist lifts. She trailed off, a question more than a statement. Elena felt the familiar tension of these moments. She was the guide. They'd hired her for her knowledge, her experience, her ability to make decisions that kept them safe. She knew these trails intimately, had walked them in all seasons and weather conditions. The direct path was indeed faster, and Daniel's logic about the weather was sound. If efficiency and speed were the only measures, he was absolutely right. But Elena also knew that the Ridge Trail wound through a grove of ancient hemlocks, trees that had watched centuries pass, their massive trunks creating a cathedral of shadow and filtered light. She knew there was a place where the mist sometimes lifted suddenly, revealing the valley below in a moment of such unexpected beauty that even the most hurried hikers stopped and forgot about their schedules. She knew that the gentler grade would allow for conversation, for noticing details, for the kind of walking where the mind could wander and rest. She could override Daniel's suggestion. She could explain, with her authority as guide, that experience trumped map reading, that she knew better, and perhaps she did know better in some objective sense. But would Daniel learn anything from being overruled? Would the group benefit from her imposing her preference? even if it was the right one? Her old mentor's words returned to her. A good guide doesn't just lead people up a mountain. A good guide helps them discover what kind of journey they need. Elena looked at Daniel thoughtfully. You make a valid point about the weather and timing, she said, and she meant it. His concern was real, his reasoning sound. The direct route would get us to the summit faster, and that's valuable. She paused, then gestured to the right-hand path. Here's what I see differently, and I might be wrong. This is just my perspective, but I think the ridge trail offers something the direct route doesn't. Not efficiency, but experience. Daniel's posture shifted slightly, no longer defensive but curious. Elena continued, choosing her words carefully. You're right that we might not see the valley through the mist, but the gentler grade means we can walk together, talk, notice things. The hemlocks along that path are 300 years old. There's value in that, even if it takes longer. But, she emphasized the word, you've raised a real concern about the weather, and that matters too. She turned to the group. What if we take a vote? Both routes reach the summit. Both are safe. Daniel's route is faster and more direct, which is merit. The ridge route is longer but offers different rewards. What kind of journey do we want today? The discussion that followed was brief but genuine. Margaret wanted the hemlocks and the possibility of light. The Seattle couple didn't mind the extra time. Robert, surprisingly, sided with Daniel's logic about the weather. Sarah admitted she liked more opportunities to stop and sketch. In the end, they chose the ridge trail, 4-2. But Daniel didn't seem disappointed. I can see the appeal, he said, folding his map. And we can always adjust if the weather actually turns. The mist did lift, about an hour into the ridge trail, revealing the valley in layers of blue and green that seemed to go on forever. They stood at a rocky outcrop, Margaret photographing, Sarah sketching, even Daniel quiet and still, and Elena felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. Not because her way had been chosen, but because the choice had been made together, with respect for different perspectives. As they walked on through the ancient hemlocks, Daniel fell into step beside her. I was wrong about one thing, he said. I thought efficiency was what mattered. But this, he gestured at the towering trees, the dappled light, the easy pace that allowed for conversation and observation. This is worth the extra time. Elena smiled. You weren't wrong. Efficiency does matter. Sometimes the direct route is exactly what a group needs. When weather is threatening, when someone's injured, when the goal is simply to reach the summit. Your instinct was good. It just wasn't the only good instinct. That's generous of you to say. It's true, Elena replied. I've guided long enough to know that there's rarely one right way to climb a mountain. Just different ways, each with its own wisdom. She paused to let the others catch up, watching them move through the cathedral of trees with varying degrees of wonder and fatigue. My job isn't to always know the best path. It's to help people consider their options and choose the journey that serves them. The summit, when they reached it 3 hours later, was wrapped in cloud. They couldn't see the promised views, couldn't take the panoramic photos they'd imagined. But no one seemed disappointed. they'd found something else along the way. Connection, beauty, the pleasure of a journey taken at a pace that allowed for both destination and discovery. As they began their descent, taking the direct route down as Daniel had suggested, a practical choice everyone agreed upon, Elena reflected that respect wasn't about always deferring to others' opinions, nor was it about always asserting her own expertise. It was about creating space where different perspectives could be voiced, considered, and valued, where people could disagree and still walk forward together, each one bringing their own wisdom to the shared path. The next story's title is The Sunset Architect. The construction site lay quiet in the late afternoon light, dust motes hanging golden in the air between unfinished walls. James stood in what would become the library of the community center, his blueprint rolled in one hand, his other hand resting against a wooden beam still fragrant with sawdust and resin. Outside, the sounds of the city had softened into the gentle rhythm of day's end, traffic moving slower, voices calling farewells, the distant laughter of children being called home for dinner. He could see them through the empty window frames, his crew gathering their tools, coiling extension cords, sweeping sawdust into careful piles. 23 people who had worked under his direction for the past 4 months, their labor gradually transforming architectural drawings into solid reality. Carpenters and electricians, plumbers and painters, each one bringing their particular skill to the greater whole. The building smelled of fresh lumber and drywall compound, of paint primer and the mineral scent of concrete that had been poured just days before. James breathed it in, this smell of creation, of something emerging from nothing through the coordinated effort of many hands. The floor was gritty beneath his boots, covered in the fine white dust that seemed to coat everything on a job site, no matter how often they swept. Through the western windows, the sun hung low and heavy, turning the sky shades of amber and rose. The light came through at a sharp angle, illuminating the grain in the wooden beams, casting long shadows across the subflooring. In a few weeks, this space would have walls and paint and carpet, would be filled with books and reading chairs and the quiet murmur of people seeking knowledge. But for now, it was raw and honest, its bones visible, its structure exposed. James had been a project manager for 18 years, had overseen dozens of buildings from foundation to ribbon cutting. He'd learned the technical skills early, how to read blueprints, calculate load-bearing requirements, manage schedules and budgets. But what he hadn't learned, not in any classroom or manual, was how to lead people. That knowledge had come slowly, painfully, through mistakes he still regretted and lessons that had cost him good workers and, once, an entire crew. Michael was cleaning his work area near the far wall, moving methodically as he always did, his tools arranged with the precision James had come to recognize as the mark of a true craftsman. The young carpenter had been with them for 3 months now, recommended by another contractor, and his work was exceptional. Joints that fit seamlessly, measurements accurate to a fraction of an inch, a patience with difficult cuts that bordered on meditative. But yesterday, James had found an error, a series of cabinet frames built to the wrong specifications, a misreading of the blueprint that would require several days of work to correct. The materials alone would cost nearly $2,000, not to mention the time, the delay to the schedule, the cascade of adjustments other trades would need to make. James had discovered the mistake late in the day, after Michael had left. He'd stood there in the gathering dusk, his jaw tight, anger rising hot in his chest. How could someone so skilled make such a careless error? Didn't Michael understand the importance of double-checking measurements, the cost implications, the way one person's mistake affected everyone else on the crew? He'd spent the evening composing what he would say, his words sharp and precise, designed to ensure this never happened again. He would call Michael aside first thing in the morning, show him the error, explain exactly how much it would cost and why such carelessness was unacceptable. Make an example, perhaps, not cruelly, but clearly enough that everyone understood the standards expected on his job sites. That had been his plan. That had been his instinct, honed by years of managing projects where mistakes meant delays and delays meant money and money meant the difference between success and failure. But lying in bed, unable to sleep, James had remembered another job site, another mistake, another young worker. That time, James had been the one making the error, a miscalculation in the foundation that could have compromised the entire structure if his mentor hadn't caught it. He remembered the sick feeling in his stomach when he'd realized what he'd done, the shame, the certainty that he'd be fired or at least humiliated in front of the crew. His mentor had called him aside quietly, and the first words out of the older man's mouth had been, "James, your work on the framing last week was outstanding. The precision of those joints. I've seen contractors with 20 years experience who can't match that quality." James had stood there, confused, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But his mentor had continued, "You've got real talent, and I've noticed how the other guys come to you with questions. You explain things clearly, patiently. That's a gift." Only then had he mentioned the foundation error, framing it as a learning opportunity, something that could be fixed, a mistake that didn't define James's value or potential. That conversation had stayed with James for 18 years. Not because of the criticism. He couldn't even remember the exact words used to describe his error, but because of the praise that came first, the acknowledgement of his worth before the discussion of his mistake. Now James stood in the unfinished library, watching Michael work, and made a decision. "Michael," he called, walking across the dusty floor. "Got a minute?" The young carpenter straightened, wiping his hands on his work pants. James could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the wariness in his eyes. Word had probably spread about the cabinet frames. Michael knew something was coming. "I wanted to talk to you about the casework in the East Wing," James began, and watched Michael's jaw tighten. "But first, and I should have said this weeks ago, your craftsmanship on this project has been exceptional. That archway you built in the entrance. I've had 3 other contractors ask me who did that work. The joint work is gallery quality. Seriously impressive." Michael blinked, surprise replacing wariness. "Thank you. That means a lot." "I mean it," James continued. "And I've noticed how you help the younger apprentices. Yesterday I saw you spending your lunch break showing that kid. What's his name? Tommy. How to properly set a mitosaur. That kind of mentorship, that patience, it raises the quality of the whole crew." He paused, letting that settle. "You've got the makings of an excellent lead carpenter, Michael. Real leadership potential." The young man's posture had shifted entirely now. Shoulders relaxed, a slight smile emerging. James felt something release in his own chest. The anger from yesterday transforming into something more useful, more constructive. "Now," James said gently, "we do need to talk about those cabinet frames." They walked together to the area where the cabinets stood, and James explained the era. But the conversation was different now, transformed by what had come before. Michael listened without defensiveness, asked good questions, immediately understood the implications and offered solutions. They discussed the correction process, the timeline, the lessons to be learned about blueprint verification. "I'm sorry," Michael said finally. "I should have double-checked those measurements. I will from now on." "I appreciate that," James replied. "And honestly, in 18 years of doing this work, I've never had a carpenter who didn't make at least one significant mistake. What matters is how we handle it, what we learn, and whether we let it make us better at our craft." He smiled. "Given the quality of everything else you've done here, I have zero doubt you'll learn from this and come back even stronger." As the sun dipped lower, painting the unfinished walls in shades of copper and gold, James gathered the full crew for their end-of-day briefing. He made a point of acknowledging several workers by name, calling out specific accomplishments, noting improvements and exceptional work. The electrical team that had finished the main panel ahead of schedule, the plumber who'd solved a tricky drainage problem with creative thinking, the painter whose primer coat was so flawlessly smooth it would need minimal finish work. He saw faces brighten, backs straighten, heard the energy in voices as people headed home. Tomorrow they would return, including Michael, who would spend several days correcting his error. But he would return with his dignity intact, his value recognized, his potential affirmed. James locked up the site as twilight deepened into evening. Walking to his truck, he thought about his old mentor, wondered if the man had known how deeply that single conversation would shape James's approach to leadership. Probably not. Kindness often worked that way, quietly, invisibly, its effects rippling out through years and lives in ways that couldn't be measured or predicted. The building rose behind him, half-finished but promising, like the people who built it, like James himself, works in progress, learning and growing, finding that the strongest foundation was always the same, recognition, respect, and the simple acknowledgement that everyone's work matters, everyone's contribution has value, and everyone deserves to be reminded of their worth before being shown their mistakes. The next story's title is The Keeper of the Lighthouse. The morning fog clung to the rocky shore like a living thing, thick and salt-heavy, muffling the crash of waves against the base of the lighthouse. Thomas stood at the lantern room window, his hand resting against the cold iron frame, watching the gray world slowly reveal itself as dawn approached. The glass panes around him were streaked with condensation, tiny rivulets running down in patterns that caught what little light filtered through the mist. Below, he could hear the rhythmic percussion of water meeting stone, a sound that had been the constant soundtrack of his life for 32 years. The lighthouse rose 100 feet above the sea, its white tower a sentinel against the dark rocks and darker water. Inside, the circular staircase wound down through floors that held his living quarters, his equipment, his carefully maintained logs documenting 3 decades of vigilance. The air in the lantern room carried the distinct smell of lamp oil, metal polish, and the perpetual dampness that came from living surrounded by ocean. Thomas breathed it in, this familiar mixture, but today it brought no comfort. His eyes moved to the great Fresnel lens that dominated the space, its prismatic glass segments designed to amplify and project light across 20 miles of open water. The lens gleamed, polished to perfection as it always was. But the lamp itself, the critical light that should have burned through the night, sat cold and dark. Thomas had discovered it 3 hours ago, waking with a sudden certainty that something was wrong. Racing up the stairs in the pre-dawn darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs, he'd found what he'd feared. The lamp extinguished, the automated mechanism that should have kept it burning somehow failed. The lighthouse had stood dark through the critical hours between midnight and dawn, when coastal fog was thickest and ships most vulnerable. In the growing light, he could see the harbor beginning to take shape through the fog. And there, emerging like a ghost ship from the gray, was the harbor master's vessel making its scheduled monthly inspection visit. Captain Morrison, punctual as always, arriving at first light to review the logs and check the maintenance records. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities, excuses forming and reforming like the fog outside. The mechanism had been temperamental lately. He could say it finally failed completely, which was true. He could point out that he'd logged concerns about it weeks ago, requesting replacement parts that hadn't arrived, which was also true. He could explain that he'd been fighting off a cold, that his sleep had been deeper than usual, that any keeper might have missed the failure in the night. All of these explanations were factual. All of them would be partially understood by Captain Morrison, who knew the challenges of maintaining a lighthouse with aging equipment and limited resources. The harbor master was a reasonable man, fair in his assessments, understanding of the difficulties inherent in this solitary work. Thomas could construct a narrative that minimized his responsibility, that distributed blame across circumstances and failing equipment and bureaucratic delays in funding. He'd heard other keepers do exactly this when problems arose, frame mistakes as inevitable results of impossible conditions, paint themselves as victims of systems beyond their control. And perhaps that narrative wouldn't even be entirely false. The equipment was old, the funding was limited, the work was demanding, requiring constant vigilance that no human could perfectly maintain forever. But beneath all these true facts lay another truth, simpler and harder to speak. Thomas had made a mistake. He'd been tired yesterday, bone-tired in a way that had accumulated over weeks of disrupted sleep and the endless maintenance demands of the lighthouse. When he'd performed his evening inspection, he'd been thorough but perhaps not as focused as usual. He'd checked the lamp, seen it burning steadily, verified the fuel level and the mechanism's operation. But he hadn't lingered, hadn't watched long enough to catch the subtle hesitation in the mechanism that might have warned him of impending failure. More significantly, he disabled the alarm that should have woken him when the light failed. The alarm, a bell that rang in his quarters, had been malfunctioning, clanging at irregular intervals for reasons he hadn't been able to diagnose. 3 nights ago, frustrated and desperate for uninterrupted sleep, he'd disconnected it. He'd meant to reconnect it the next day, after he'd had rest enough to properly diagnose the problem. But he'd forgotten. For 3 nights, he'd slept without the safety net that alarm provided. And last night, when it might have saved him, when it might have woken him to relight the lamp before any ships came near, it had sat silent because he'd made it silent. Thomas pressed his forehead against the cold glass, watching the harbor master's boat draw closer. He could hear his father's voice from decades ago, from lessons learned when Thomas was young and new to lighthouse keeping. Equipment fails. Weather happens. But a keeper who makes excuses is more dangerous than any storm. Ships depend on our honesty as much as our light. Captain Morrison's boots rang on the iron stays, announcing his arrival long before his head appeared through the floor hatch. He was a solid man in his 50s, weathered by decades at sea, his uniform impeccably maintained despite the fog-damp morning. He pulled himself into the lantern room with the ease of long practice, already pulling out his inspection clipboard. "Morning, Thomas. Quite a fog we're having. Good thing ships know they can count on." He stopped, his eyes moving from Thomas's face to the cold lamp. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Thomas didn't wait for the question. "Captain Morrison, I need to tell you immediately. The lighthouse was dark from approximately midnight until I discovered it at 3 this morning. No ships were scheduled through that window, and I've seen no evidence of any vessels in distress. But that's luck, not vigilance." The words came out steady, clear, devoid of the excuses that had been assembling themselves in his mind. The failure was my responsibility. Morrison's expression was unreadable. He walked to the lamp, examined the mechanism, checked the fuel levels. The equipment's old, he said finally. I can see where the mechanism seized up. These things happen. They do, Thomas agreed. But that's not the whole story. He took a breath, feeling something release in his chest even as his throat tightened. 3 nights ago, I disabled the alarm that should have alerted me to the light failure. I meant to fix it and reconnect it, but I forgot. If it had been functioning, I would have been woken immediately. I could have relit the lamp within minutes. Instead, the lighthouse stood dark for 3 hours because I failed to maintain a critical safety system. Morrison turned to face him fully now. Thomas continued, the word coming easier now that he'd started. I should also tell you that I've been fighting fatigue, and my evening inspection yesterday wasn't as thorough as it should have been. I checked the lamp, but I didn't watch it long enough to catch what might have been early signs of the mechanism's failure. He gestured to his logbook on the small desk. It's all documented there, every detail, including my failures. The captain was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Thomas, the cold lamp, and the logbook. Then, surprisingly, he extended his hand. Thank you for your honesty, Thomas. That took courage. Thomas shook his hand, confusion evident on his face. I failed in my duty. I endangered ships. You made mistakes, Morrison corrected. There's a difference in the way you've handled it. Immediately admitting fault, taking full responsibility, documenting everything clearly. That tells me more about your character than 32 years of perfect service ever could. He gestured toward the lamp. Any keeper can maintain a light when everything goes right. It's how you handle failure that reveals who you are. They spend the next hour going through the maintenance logs together, Morrison asking questions, Thomas answering with complete transparency. There would be a formal report, a notation in his record, a requirement for additional safety protocols. But there would not be the disciplinary action Thomas had feared, nor the loss of position he'd been certain was coming. As Morrison prepared to leave, he paused at the top of the stairs. I've inspected 4 to 7 lighthouses in my career, Thomas. I've seen keepers blame equipment, weather, budget cuts, everything except themselves. You know what I've learned? The ones who make excuses are the ones who will make the same mistakes again. The ones who admit fault quickly and completely. They're the ones I trust most. After the captain departed, Thomas stood in the lantern room as the fog began to lift, revealing the coastline in sharp detail. He felt lighter somehow, despite the mark that would now appear in his record. The burden of concealment, of constructing elaborate justifications, would have weighed far more than the simple truth had. That evening, as the sun set and he prepared to light the lamp for another night, Thomas thought about trust and honesty, about how admitting failure quickly and emphatically wasn't weakness but strength. The lamp burned steady and bright, its beams sweeping across the darkening water, and Thomas watched it with renewed commitment, not to perfection that was impossible for any human to maintain, but to honesty, to immediate acknowledgement when he fell short, to the understanding that integrity mattered more than an unblemished record. The lighthouse stood tall in the gathering dark, its light a promise to ships at sea, and Thomas, its keeper, understood now that the strongest foundation for trust wasn't never failing. It was never hiding when you did. The last story's title is The Master Weaver. The workshop smelled of wool and beeswax, of the cedar oil Miriam used to condition the loom's wooden frame, and beneath it all, the faint dusty scent of fiber that had permeated the stone walls over decades. Afternoon light streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air, each tiny particle catching and releasing the sun like miniature stars. The light fell across the great loom that dominated the room, its vertical thread stretched taut and gleaming, waiting. Miriam sat on her worn bench, her fingers moving through a basket of dyed yarn, indigo blues and madder reds, yellows from weld and soft grays from walnut hulls. Each skein had been prepared by her own hands, the colors coaxed from plants and minerals through processes she'd learned 60 years ago from her grandmother. The wool was soft against her palms, still holding the slight oiliness of lanolin, resilient and warm. Across the room, her apprentice Maya worked at a smaller practice loom, the shuttle moving back and forth with the rhythmic thunk of the beater pressing each row of weft into place. The sound was steady, methodical, but Miriam could hear the slight hesitation between passes, the pause that suggested uncertainty. Maya had been with her for 8 months now, learning the fundamental techniques, how to warp a loom, maintain consistent tension, read a pattern draft. But technique was only the beginning. What Miriam needed to pass on couldn't be taught through demonstration alone. It was understanding, intuition, the ability to see how color and pattern worked together to create something that transcended mere cloth. The complex geometric design she'd been commissioned to recreate for the museum, a pattern from her grandmother's generation, required not just skilled hands but a weaver's eye, a sense of how each thread related to every other. She'd tried teaching it directly at first, showing Maya the traditional pattern, explaining the sequence of thread colors, the intricate dance of heddles and treadles. But Maya had become overwhelmed, anxious, following instructions so carefully that the work lost its life. The fabric she produced was technically correct but somehow lifeless, each row executed with such nervous precision that the overall beauty disappeared. Miriam understood. She'd been the same way once, paralyzed by the weight of tradition, terrified of making mistakes. The museum piece needed to be started soon. Miriam had the contract, the specifications, the natural dyed yarns all prepared. She could weave it herself. Her hands still held their skill. Her eyes could still judge color and tension. But Miriam was 7 to 9 years old, and her fingers grew stiff in the mornings now, required warming before they could work with their old fluency. More than that, she knew her time for weaving was drawing to a close, and the pattern needed to live beyond her. Maya was talented. Miriam had seen it from the first day the young woman had entered the workshop, her hands already understanding the logic of thread even as she struggled with the specific techniques. But talent wasn't enough. Maya needed confidence, ownership, the sense that she wasn't just reproducing someone else's vision but creating something of her own. Miriam had watched other master weavers try to pass on their knowledge. Most taught the way they'd been taught, through strict instruction, exact replication, the insistence that there was one right way to achieve a particular effect. Some apprentices thrived under that approach, but others, like Maya, like Miriam herself had been, needed something different. They needed to discover rather than be told, to feel the pattern emerge through their own understanding rather than having it imposed from above. The traditional pattern was called the meadow path, a complex interweaving of colors that created the illusion of a winding trail through wildflowers. It required 7 colors of weft thread, each one appearing and disappearing in a sequence that seemed random until you stepped back and saw the whole. The difficulty wasn't in any single row but in maintaining the vision of the overall design while executing hundreds of individual passes of the shuttle. Miriam had an idea, risky but potentially transformative. Instead of teaching the pattern directly, she could create conditions for Maya to discover it herself, but it would require patience, indirection, and the willingness to let Maya struggle and potentially fail. It would mean resisting the urge to correct, to demonstrate, to show the right way. Most difficult of all, it would mean allowing Maya to believe the discovery was entirely her own, even though Miriam would be carefully orchestrating every step. That felt manipulative in a way that made Miriam uncomfortable. But was it manipulation if the goal was genuine learning? If Maya truly did discover something real through the process? Her grandmother's voice returned to her. A good teacher makes themselves invisible. The student should feel like the knowledge grew in their own mind, like discovering something that was always there. Miriam stood, her knees protesting slightly, and walked to the great loom. She began warping it, setting up the vertical threads in a neutral cream color. But as she worked, she made specific choices, spacing certain threads slightly farther apart, using a particular tension that would favor certain types of patterns. When Maya finished her practice piece and came to see what Miriam was working on, she found the older weaver standing before the newly warped loom with a puzzled expression, several skeins of colored yarn laid out on the bench. "Maya, could you give me your opinion on something?" Miriam asked, her tone casual but with a note of genuine uncertainty. "I'm starting the museum commission, but I'm second-guessing my approach. I'd value a fresh perspective." Maya approached cautiously, honored to be asked but clearly nervous. "Of course, though I'm not sure how much help I'll be." Miriam gestured to the yarn. The pattern is meant to suggest a path through a meadow. I have these 7 colors, but I'm struggling with how to begin. Usually, I'd start with the darkest or lightest value, but she trailed off, letting the sentence hang. What do you think? If you were trying to create the sense of a path, how would you start? Maya studied the colors, picking up first the indigo, then setting it down for a soft green. A path would be, I guess it would be where the grass is worn away. She touched the cream warp threads, so maybe the background shouldn't be one solid color, but these lighter threads here could be the path itself. Interesting, Miriam said, and she meant it. Maya was seeing it, beginning to understand. Show me what you mean. Why don't you try a few rows, just experimentally, and see what happens? Over the next hour, Maya worked with careful attention, trying different color combinations, weaving a few rows and then unweaving them when they didn't feel right. Miriam sat nearby, pretending to work on preparing more yarn, but mostly watching. When Maya made choices that moved toward the traditional pattern, Miriam said nothing. When Maya moved in wrong directions, Miriam asked gentle questions. What feeling are you trying to create there? How does that color interact with the one before? Slowly, row by row, Maya began discovering the pattern, not as a set of instructions to follow, but as a logical solution to the problem she'd been given. The darker colors naturally fell back to suggest depth. The lighter ones came forward. The path emerged not because she was told to create it, but because her hands and eyes found the way. 3 weeks later, the piece was half finished, and Maya worked with a confidence Miriam had never seen before. The pattern that emerged was remarkably close to the traditional design, but with small variations that were entirely Maya's, a slightly different balance of colors in one section, a subtle shift in the path curve in another. The cloth was beautiful, alive in a way that strict reproduction never could have achieved. I can't believe I figured this out, Maya said during a break, stepping back to view her work. When you first showed me those colors, I had no idea how they come together. But once I started experimenting, it was like the pattern just revealed itself. Miriam smiled, sipping her tea. That's how the best weaving happens. The pattern is already there in the materials, in the logic of warp and weft. We just have to listen carefully enough to hear what it wants to become. I keep thinking about the original weavers who developed this pattern, Maya continued, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. They must have gone through the same process, trying things, seeing what worked, building the design through discovery rather than following instructions. Exactly, Miriam said softly. You're part of that tradition now. Not because you've replicated what came before, but because you've experienced the same creative journey they did. That evening, after Maya had left, Miriam sat before the loom in the fading light, examining the work with satisfaction. The pattern was emerging beautifully, perhaps more beautifully than if she'd woven it herself with all her decades of experience. Because Maya believed it was her discovery, she'd poured herself into it completely, holding nothing back, taking risks that Miriam might not have taken. The old weaver ran her fingers gently across the cloth, feeling the texture, the slight irregularities that spoke of human hands and genuine engagement. Yes, she had guided Maya, had created conditions for discovery, had asked questions designed to lead in particular directions. But the discovery had been real. The ownership was genuine, and the pride Maya felt was completely earned. Miriam thought about all the knowledge she still needed to pass on, the patterns and techniques accumulated over a lifetime. But tonight, she learned something herself, that the greatest gift a teacher could give wasn't information, but the space for discovery. Not instruction, but invitation. Not this is how it's done, but what do you think? Outside, the last light faded from the sky. Inside, the loom held its half-finished pattern, waiting for tomorrow, when Maya would return and continue the work she believed was entirely her own creation. And in that belief lay the truest kind of teaching, invisible, generous, and more powerful than any demonstration could ever be. Now, as we close the book on the Weaver, let us sit in the silence of the library for a moment. Listen to the sleepy music, feel the warmth of the fire, and let the lesson settle into your heart like a seed in the soil. Good night, traveler. The library is at rest now, and so are you.